Welcome back to the I Can't Sleep podcast. I'm your host, Dominic Fontaine, and thanks for taking time and listening. Today, I'm telling you about a couple of ghost-related stories at Goddard College, as well as two stories from Brian Boyes, a current music teacher who attended Goddard College, and his personal paranormal experience at Goddard. To start, I interviewed Brian Boyes, who was a student at Goddard, and I asked him if he had any weird or other paranormal stories or encounters during his time at Goddard. Brian told me he had two stories he wanted to share, but I will be telling his story as if I was him. Brian started out with a story titled The Garden House. It was Sunday night in November, and there was about 5 or 6 of us lingering in the dining hall after dinner. My friends and I were sitting with a couple older Goddard students who had been on campus for a few years now. The conversation ultimately landed on a debate as if whether Goddard's haunted or not. Some people were absolutely convinced that the campus was haunted by previous students or other ancient entities. There's talk of both current and former students who claim to be able to see other beings not from this realm. They say they would see them walking down a pathway or even in the woods. Some have even seen them in the dorms. And of course, there were many stories about both in the manor and the garden house. After 45 minutes of our hour-long talk through many of the stories and experiences that had been at Goddard, Patrick said, "We should definitely go up to the garden house and the manor." It was a classic New England fall night. It was chilly and a full moon and it was really windy. As we left the dining hall and headed up the path to the garden house, our enthusiasm shifted to the trepidation. Similarly, as we neared up the garden house, the light from the hay barn dimmed and things became increasingly dark and kind of spooky. During dinner, Patrick had told us a story of the garden house, about a family named the Martins. They were a family that lived on the grounds in the 1920s, when they built a large manor house, the gardens, and accompanying buildings. When the garden house was built, the family traveled down to Salem, Mass, where they retrieved a large beam from the Salem courthouse that was being torn down. This was the beam that Susanna Martin, who was the ancestor of the family, had been hung during the Salem witch trials. I believe the garden house was built in her honor. The upper garden was a pretty elaborate space with 2 large stone steps that led up to the garden. As you walked up those steps, you could see 2 stone sculptures of ram heads built into this 15-foot stone wall. Upon entering the garden, you came across a round 10 fountain that connected to the water duct that was built to the shape of a Celtic cross. On the other side of the fountain was a garden house. These days, you can walk into the garden house and see what it looks like on the inside. However, while I was a student there, all the doors and windows to the little house were boarded up. So for the students there at the time, it was really much of a mystery what was actually in there. Where the door should be, there were 2 very large pieces of plywood blocking the way. Patrick led us to the house and gently knocked on the plywood. He gently called Susanna's name and knocked twice. Despite the wind, we were able to hear scratching on the plywood and a return of 3 knocks that came on the other side of the house. I immediately froze and didn't know what to do. The next thing I recall is my friend Megan, who's a very quirky individual, walking over to the rear corner of the garden. Despite a nearly full moon, there was a lot of shadows from overhanging trees in the back of the garden. Megan quickly disappeared out of sight as she ventured into the back shadows. We could barely make out her saying something. And then all of a sudden, she came running out of the shadows, screaming, "Run! Go! Go!" At that point, we completely freaked out, followed Megan, as she ran out of the garden, back to the path. We continued running until we got to our dorms, and asked, "What happened? We all want to know." Megan said that she was near the back corner of the garden and started to hear sounds, and then immediately surrounded by something that felt like many different people were surrounding her, making her feel trapped, making her feel scared, not knowing what to do. Suffice to say, we never went back to the garden at night again. Well, at least not a night like that. The second story Brian wanted to share was titled The Hay Barn. He starts out by saying, "I was a junior in college and my girlfriend who lived on campus, and I lived in Burlington, but she was at Goddard and Plainfield on campus. I remember we got into a fight, or there was some kind of disagreement. I don't quite remember much about it. I remember I stormed out, and the idea of driving back to Burlington was not something I wanted to do. So I decided just to go sleep in the hay barn, and only a few people had the combination to the piano box where I was going to sleep. It was a beautiful Steinway grand piano, which is pretty amazing, but that's not part of the story anyway. So, it was a box that held a piano, so it was pretty big, but not that big. I decided to go to sleep in the box, and so I do the combination on the padlock and go into the box and close the door. I lie down underneath the piano and just try to sleep. So I fell asleep, and then in the middle of the night, I started hearing a sound like bouncing ball, like a basketball being dropped from the intervals between each bounce. It was pretty long. It was like as if it was being dropped from the ceiling of the hay barn, like the rafters. That's how high it was. So it was like boom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Boom. I woke up to the bouncing and was listening to it, wondering what was going on. I had no idea, but it was freaky enough to the point where I did not want to open that door to the piano box and see what it was. Actually, now that I think of it, it was so dark in there that I wouldn't have been able to see anything out there anyway. So as the bouncing continued, I just got more and more freaked out, and eventually after 10-20 minutes, I fell back asleep till morning rose. I don't remember how we resolved things with my girlfriend, but we must have worked it out because we were living together after that. We have a few other ghost encounter stories, more anonymous stories than anything. The first story is titled, "A Ghost with a Talent for Music is Reputed to Occupy the Manor House of Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont." A prospective student walked into the manor house only to find a man playing the piano. The student asked the man for direction, but the question was ignored while the strange man continued to play. The perplexed student walked out in frustration. She was heading to the upper garden when she turned around and noticed the mysterious man playing and laughing at her. The unusual specter then vanished into thin air. Who could this mysterious player have been? Similar stories have been reported by others who visit the manor. There was also recent reports of unusual occurrences, such as camera malfunctions and orbs of light of the manor as well. The next is titled Dawson's Creek. The old Martin Manor, part of an extinct farm that was reincarnated as Goddard College, was used for many years as a girls' dormitory. Its creepy Victorian elegance was enhanced by frequent tales of phantom footsteps in the upper stairs hallway. Occasionally, young women were alarmed when a transparent middle-aged man wandered into their rooms. The semi-visible pacer is believed to be a young remains of a loyal butler named Dawson, who must have been doing his rounds as if he was still alive. Our final story is titled Goddard's Ghost. The conference coordinator at Goddard College experiences a mysterious encounter one evening while preparing for the conference at Martin Manor with his daughters. They hear enchanting piano music emanating from the locked room and discover a figure in black at the piano, only to realize it has no hands. After the ghostly music stops, the figure vanishes. Francis reflects from the long-standing rumors about the manor's supernatural occurrences, including stories of ghosts, Ouija board sessions, and unexplained noises. Martin Manor, built by Willard S. Martin in 1908, is steeped into history and linked to the tragic tale of Susanna Martin, who was the accused witch executed in Salem. Despite the eerie legends and college atmosphere it offers, solace to memories of those misunderstood women, with the haunting melodies of classical composers echoing through the halls. As a former student, the narrator revisits these ghost stories, interviewing them with their educational experiences at college. If you want to hear more ghost stories at Goddard, visit vermonter.com. Once again, thanks for taking the time to listen to this episode of I Can't Sleep podcast, and have a great rest of your night.